This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Like Progressive home and auto policies, they're best when they're bundled too. Having these two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary.
Hello, friends. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. I'm Lee C. Camp. You're listening to our unabridged interview with the author Philip Yancey. Philip Yancey has something like 17 million books in print, a beloved author, and his tales of in his most recent memoir were the focus of our conversation taped there in Nashville this past year. A moving and beautiful conversation, as so many of our conversations are with our guests. This one I found especially interesting because, one, Yancey was raised in the South like me, and he was also raised in a pretty strict fundamentalist upbringing, which has some similarities to my own. And I was remembering, as I say in the edited piece for broadcast, that years ago when my wife and I were talking to a therapist about a family member who was going into rehab, and she was talking to us about what the family could expect with this family member. I was very young at the time. This was long before we had kids, and she knew that I had gone to seminary, and she knew at the time I was working on a PhD in theology, and she looked at me after schooling us on some of these things and looked me in the eye and she said, "Now I have something to say to you." She said, "Bad theology messes up people's lives." And it was one of those pivotal moments that I've long remembered and tried to pay a lot of attention to, and realizing the ways in which we talk about God and the ways we talk about faith can have a profound impact and can certainly have a strongly deleterious impact upon others. And Yancey's storytelling makes this so clear and so plain, and distressingly so. But even out of all of that, the ways in which he found things like beauty and love, opening him up to new possibilities to think about the meaning of the word or the person or the reality of God or faith, it yields a beautiful and redemptive story. Enjoy. Here's Philip Yancey. Philip Yancey is the author of more than 24 books, which have garnered 13 Gold Medallion Book Awards. He currently has more than 17 million books in print, being published in more than 50 languages worldwide. Philip worked as a journalist and freelance author in Chicago for 20 years, writing for a wide variety of publications, including Reader's Digest, The Atlantic, National Wildlife, and Christianity Today. Currently, he and his wife Janet live in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. And today we're getting to sit together here in Nashville, and we're discussing Philip's recent memoir, Where the Light Fell. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you very much, Lee.
It's a delight to have you here with us today. Thank you. Your new memoir is, I truly found it beautiful and very moving. And for at least one large part, because I relate to a lot of kind of where you come from and some of the experiences that you had. But it's just so beautifully done and so well done. I'm thankful.
Well, I waited a long time to write this memoir. I, as you say, I've done nothing but write books for the last 40 years or so, but I haven't really told my own story, just little snippets of it here and there, in part because I wanted to protect family members. Probably that's the main reason. But at a certain point, I decided I've got to do it. I've got to get it down. And I'm glad I did. It was a great experience, just kind of putting my own life together. That's one thing we writers don't often get to do, but it felt like putting together a jigsaw puzzle without a picture on the face to show me where I was going to end up.
Well, you say I think it's the last page of the book in your author's note, you say memory is a complicated thing. And so I would imagine that putting a memoir together like this is a complicated thing.
It is. And I remember a case where Frank McCourt wrote a wonderful memoir about growing up in very Catholic, poverty-stricken home in Limerick, Ireland. And then they interviewed his brother, and said, "Did Frank interview you before he wrote his book?" I said, "No." I said, "Well, what do you think?" He said, "Well, he got some things right and some things he got wrong." So they told that to Frank McCourt, and Frank said, "Well, then he should write his own memoir." And he did, and that became a bestseller too. But memoir is complicated. I did interview my mother, my brother, and my uncle, and everybody else I could think of, but you can't trust anybody's memory perfectly, for sure.
Yeah. So I also, you said there that you had waited for a while before writing this because you wanted to protect some people. And you also acknowledged near the end of the book that the president of the Bible college, which you attended as an undergrad, kind of pressed you in these recent years, asking why you had kind of written in a way that he appeared to find disloyal, and that you were kind of exposing these strict fundamentalisms and some of the bizarre moralisms of your school experience. And at the same time, you also talk about how your mother has felt hurt by your writing, and that you're quite open about the pain of your childhood experience. And but as we'll explore today, clearly you're not doing a hatchet job in the book because you try to be very gracious in very difficult stories that you share. But how do you think about then balancing all of that and doing that kind of work?
That's why I waited so long. I took a lot of notes and I had a lot of plans. Actually, Lee, it wasn't until I faced death. I was in a rollover accident. My Ford Explorer turned over and over 5 different times as I was rolling down a cliff. I was belted in, and I ended up with a broken neck. And that day, after they did the CAT scan, the doctor came in and said, "Oh, we have a jet standing by to fly you to Denver. We're concerned because it's what we call a comminuted fracture. It has a lot of little pieces. And if one of them has punctured your carotid artery, just to be honest with you, you're not going to make it to Denver. So you better call the people you love and tell them goodbye." Wow. Well, there's a wake-up call. So I'm strapped down and think through my life. If I do die today, what will I regret not having done? And the one thing on that agenda was write this memoir. Because a writer really only has one gift, and that's the gift of his or her own life. Good, bad. I tell some of the painful parts, but I look back on it, and the very process of putting it together seemed therapeutic, seemed healthy, because it made a literary whole, I guess is WHOLE. It worked together. I could see how even the bad things were useful to me, and because they sent me on a search. If I didn't like something growing up, then I was free to explore it. How can I correct it? It's one thing to say, "Oh, the church is full of hypocrites," and the church I grew up in was full of hypocrites. It's another thing to say, "Well, then what should it have looked like? What should I look like?" And I feel blessed, actually. That would be the right word. I feel blessed that I've been able to spend my career thrashing through my own questions of faith and my own puzzles of faith, and making a living while doing that. That's a great blessing.
Yeah. So the big frame of your memoir is it's first your father's death, and that you discover in your early 20s, I guess you were, that there had been a secret, a lie, really, about your father's death. And you even say that you began to see him as perhaps a, quote, a sort of holy fool, end quote. Tell us about that.
Yes, I was 1 year old when my father died, and so I have no conscious memory of him at all. I just have other people's memories, and they painted him as this giant of faith. He was not raised in a particularly religious background, but he went into the Navy in World War II and was actually sailing on the way to Pearl Harbor when the war ended, when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he had a rather dramatic conversion, I think, trying to get God to get him out of the Navy. That didn't work, but he didn't have to go to war, so that was good. And he came back and was a truly converted person. He decided, I want to be a missionary to Africa. And he had met the person who became my mother in the meantime. They got married, and as potential missionaries do, went around and got several thousand people to agree to pray for them, and pay for them, donate money to support them on the mission field. And just before they went, a pandemic was raging in the United States. In this case, it was a pandemic of polio. Mostly polio affected children, 3 to 5 years of age. My father, however, was 23, and it was a bit of an anomaly that a person that age would get the kind of polio he did. In one day, he was completely paralyzed and lived for the next several months in an iron lung at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta. It was a terrible existence. He couldn't move. They had no televisions. He couldn't read a book. He just lay there all day and looked at the ceiling. And finally, he and a group of people around him decided this can't possibly be God's will. The guy wants to be a missionary, for goodness sake. And maybe we ought to pray that God would heal him. So they did. They started praying, and against all medical advice, removed him from the iron lung. And less than 2 weeks later, he died. The secret that was kept from me was not that he died. Obviously, I knew I didn't have a father, but that he died because people who claimed to speak for God actually did not. These were people who cared for him, who loved him, but they took on a prerogative they didn't have the right to take on. And that became the first of a number of issues that were a stumbling block to my faith that I had to work through, because I realized that this church, which always claimed to be right, was clearly wrong in some other ways.
So then, I guess perhaps inside that frame, the kind of next largest frame, I suppose, for the whole of the book is a vow that your mother made, which she reveals to you around the Formica table as a boy.
Yes, she went back to an old story from the Old Testament of Hannah, who was infertile and begged God, please, I just want one child, one son, and if you give me one, then I'll devote him to you. And so she got pregnant. She had a son named Samuel, and she devoted him to God. And that's what my mother did. I think behind that was her lack of trust in God being able to take complaint and anger. You know, I think a lot of people are afraid to express disappointment with God, anger at God. And they really shouldn't be. We shouldn't be, because there's a lot of that in the Bible. God gives us the words to use, words of lament, words of complaint, the Psalms, Job, Jeremiah, Lamentations, lament. It's there. And I wish my mother had felt free to just have a wrestling match with God and say, I got an unfair draw in life. I was going to serve you. And then look at this. She was not ready for life on her own, raising 2 sons. She couldn't drive a car. She had never written a check, and was living now in the South, even though she grew up in Philadelphia. So she had a lot to overcome. And she had to get that stress, that anger, that feeling of unfairness out somewhere. If you can't express it to God, what do? Well, she tended to take it out on her sons. My mother was a good woman. She was a Bible teacher, had a sterling reputation in the community, but there was a secret life at home that only my brother and I knew. And a lot of the growing up stories reflect that, that just difficult circumstances of a set of circumstances of a woman who was unprepared for the life she had to carve out and the ways that she coped, some of them admirable and some of them not admirable.
Yeah. So the vow that she makes, or the giving of you, you and your brother over to God, describe a little bit more for how that seems to operate. First, specifically, she makes a vow that you and your brother
go
Marshall
to Africa and replace them as missionaries. Yeah. Very specific.
So a very explicit kind of living the life that she didn't get to live through her sons.
Yeah.
And that this then becomes an expectation for you and your brother as you go. And then how do you think of how that vow, how that expectation, how this being given to God begins to operate for you in your early years psychologically?
We felt that we had no choice in our lives. I mean, part of it was kind of a thrill of being chosen by God, But my brother, for example, was an incredibly talented natural musician. Played the piano, had perfect pitch, absolute pitch, had virtually perfect musical memory. So he could hear something on the radio and a month later sit down and play it. It was just an amazing gift. And as he wanted to follow that calling, what he felt as a calling, as far as it could go, of course, that's not being a missionary in Africa. That doesn't count. So that's wrong. That's evil. And I didn't know. I just watched them quarrel and fight over that. And my brother and I went different directions. He went the prodigal son story, who never returned, who just wanted to get away as much as possible from our church, from our home, from any life like the one we grew up in. I went on a different direction, so I eventually did become a Christian, thanks to the grace of God, and have spent my life writing about that, writing about my questions of faith, but nothing that I've done ever registered as valid with my mother. She didn't read my books, just kind of scoffed at them. And the family, we both felt like failures. We both felt like there's nothing that we could do to get her approval. And ours happened to be a religious issue. I've read of others. Well, Chaim Potok writes about and My Name is Asher Lev, where one son decides, I'm an artist. I want to be an artist, not a rabbi. And the father never speaks to him again. And it was a little bit like that in our family, where if we took any choice other than fulfilling my mother's vow, then we were cursed rather than honored.
You have you have a number of quotes at the beginning, inscriptions at the beginning of your chapters that are just outstanding. And the book is worth just reading, reading the inscriptions. Yeah. But on this note, one that you have from James Fowler, there is a terrible kind of cruelty, no matter how well intended, in demanding the denial of self when there is no selfhood to deny. And it strikes me that in the context you were in, and I think the context that a lot of young people perhaps find themselves in a Christian household or Christian raising, where the very call of Christianity and the words of Christ are this kind of denial of self. Mm-hmm. And yet here you're pointing to the fact that if that's not framed quite carefully, then it's actually quite cruel. So expound on that a bit for us as you see that.
I would have to say that it's an important principle from Jesus. In fact, the statement he makes more than any other, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it goes something like this, that we don't find life by acquiring more and more. We find life by giving it away. And in the process of giving it away, you actually discover it. And it took me a long time to appreciate that until I saw it worked out in some people who have impressed me, people of great skill and ability who expended on behalf of the poor, or on behalf of a doctor I worked with for 10 years, a leprosy doctor, people on the lowest social rung anywhere in the world, people with leprosy in the lower castes in India. So I think that's deeply true, but only if there's a personal choice in the matter. I didn't have the self to give it away. I wasn't allowed the freedom, and I grew up with the image of God as a stern taskmaster trying to keep me from having fun and getting me to do things that I don't want to do. And I don't think that's the way it's supposed to be. I believe God wants us to flourish, and God wants our work, our meaningful work, to reflect our calling, who we are, what gifts we have. In my case, I eventually decided it's not being a missionary in Africa. I don't think I'd be a very good missionary at all. It's sitting in a basement office struggling with words all day. You know, it's a different kind of service, but it is a kind of service, and it's one that I feel equipped for. But when other people start playing God, whether it's a parent or a pastor or just any other people, if you start playing God in another's life, then you're treading dangerously on ground you shouldn't really be treading on.
You've already pointed to this, but in your I think the language you use is strict fundamentalist church raising upbringing. That at one point you say, quote, "My earliest memories all involve fear, both around your household, but also with regard to church." And then you also say later in the book, and this again may be in your author's note, that you have come to feel as if one of the things that you could do in your writing is to help people who can't seemingly possibly understand what that church world is like, to try to help them understand it. And so for those who don't understand this kind of sense of constantly being in fear or constantly being afraid of going to hell, or the sorts of fear and shame, what are some anecdotes, stories that kind of stand out for you in your experience that kind of would help people see what this experience was like for you?
I was completely saturated in church growing up. For instance, in high school years, we lived in a trailer, not a very large trailer, 8 by 48 feet, and there were 3 of us in there, including a piano that my brother played. And the bedroom we had required bunk beds. You couldn't get 2 beds in there, not even close. And it was located on church property. It was a church that had bought an old pony farm and converted a barn into the sanctuary. And it was a fundamentalist church proudly. We thought Southern Baptists were liberals. You know, we were independent Baptists, independent fundamental Baptists, and the same 100 people or so would show up each Sunday morning, and so many of the sermons focused on hell and hellfire. And I recall in the book that this one day when suddenly a deacon came running in and said, "There's a fire! There's a fire!" And we all went roaring out, and sure enough, the Sunday school building, which is also a converted barn, was burning down, and the fire trucks came, and it was all very exciting, and we were standing out there about 45 minutes in the hot sun, and then we all filed back inside, and I thought, well, this church is over. Oh, no. The pastor got up and gave a sermon about hellfires being 7 times hotter than that fire we just experienced, and these are the same people every week, you know, and we would take turns going forward and rededicating our lives or whatever we needed to do to end the service. And it does get to you after a while. And I reflect now because I don't live under that fear in the way I did back then. And the one positive I took away is that the decisions and the choices we make in this life do matter. They matter in an ultimate degree. And I wouldn't express them in terms of if God, if you don't please God today, he's going to smash you. That's the image of God that I had. And I later found, no, God is actually a God of love and grace and mercy and forgiveness and all these other things. And I had a very distorted image of God. But a lot of your listeners who are listening right now have some version of that fear-based religion. And it's just not, it's not a healthy thing for a child to grow up just immersed in that fear. If I do something wrong, I'm going to pay for it. My memoir is titled Where the Light Fell. And that is actually taken from a quote by St. Augustine, who said, "I couldn't look at the sun directly when I tried to do so, I got scorched. It burns your eyes to do that. And that's how I felt. I couldn't look at God directly because I had this image of God as this fearsome sinner's hand in the hand of an angry God type character, being. And it's hard to love someone like that. And what broke through to me finally were non-religious things. I had been burned by most of the religious things, but just the beauties of nature, classical music, and romantic love were the things that softened me and prepared me for just an understanding and a reception of grace.
The being raised in the South and in the era in which you were raised in the South and in this sort of church context, you say, quote, "As a true son of the South, I am born and bred a racist." And then you point to the ways in which this old Southern teaching, I don't know if it's Southern or, more across the United States in conservative fundamentalist Christianity, the story of the curse of Ham that kind of legitimated racist understandings. But how are ways that the church context supported and or cultivated racism in you?
Oh, I remember clearly a scene at summer camp I attended as a young person. So I'm maybe a sophomore in high school, and this evangelist came and he described the curse of Ham theory, which is this abominable theory. And I'm encouraged, Lee, that when I mention that, most people look kind of puzzled. They've never heard of it before, which is great.
Yeah.
But it's this distortion of a strange event that is reported in Genesis 9, where Noah's son do something unseemly. Doesn't spell out what they did, but he's naked and drunk, and something happens there. And Noah wakes up, figures out what has happened, and curses his grandson, Canaan. Canaan's father is Ham. And Ham, according to some accounts, in Hebrew means burnt black. And he curses Ham and says, "You will serve in the tents." Actually, he curses Canaan, not Ham. Curses the grandson and says, "You will serve in the tents of your brothers," including the Semite, Shem. And over the years, first Jewish and then Muslim and finally Christian theologians applied that to justify slavery. And that was still being taught in the churches I grew up in. And this evangelist at my summer camp came by and demonstrated it. He said, you'll never find a, I'll say black man or African American. That's not the word he used. You will never find one who's the CEO of a company or a physician or something like that. But they make such good waiters. Have you ever seen them, how they can walk through a crowd carrying a tray full of dishes and not spill a drop, And we just all nodded. We're kids. We don't know. He's teaching us from the Bible, right? Well, no, wrong. And the next year, I won a fellowship at what was then called the Communicable Disease Center, now the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And I had studied this resume of the person I was going to be reporting to, who is I think he was a graduate of Yale, this renowned biochemist. And I walked into his office and almost dropped the papers I was carrying because he was a black man. He was African American. And I realized the church lied to me again. They lied to me about my father. It's God's will he's going to be healed. They lied to me about race. Maybe they lied to me about Jesus. Maybe they lied to me about the Bible. And it really set me, well, first, it created a period of a couple of years where I just put all faith in abeyance. I can't look at this. I don't know what to believe right now. And then finally, it gave me a career. Okay, instead of just dissing everything you were taught, why don't you try to figure it out on your own? Why don't you go back and say, well, the Bible doesn't teach that. What does it teach?
Yeah.
And that's how I've lived for more than 50 years, just looking at pieces of faith one by one. What should I keep? What is keepable? What should I get past as a human interpretation that I can't swallow?
So if we go back to some questions about your mother and the household dynamic, So you do draw this picture in which your mother in public is seen, respected as a pious Christian servant who's doing a lot of good in the church, in the community, but at home's quite something different. And even claims, you say that she claims, you say that she hasn't sinned in 12 years?
She did, yes. And she probably would have expanded that to 30 or 40 years in time. But when I was a teenager, we would get into arguments, and she would say, well, that can't be true because I haven't sinned in 12, 13 years. And that ends the argument, right? I mean, how do you argue with a perfect person?
I think for whatever reason, I don't know why, but my wife picked up the book before I had started reading it, and she had just flipped through, and she handed me the book, and she said, read this page. And it was a story about you learning to ride a bike, and that you had wanted your mother to take the training wheels off the bike.
Right.
And you had tried once, didn't work. You asked her to put them back on. You tried again, got the training wheels put on, didn't work. You asked her to take them off. And then a third time you asked her to put them on, and that time she said, don't ask me to take them off again.
Right.
And you go out and you can't learn how to ride the bike. And so you screw up the courage to ask her to take them off. And would you tell us kind of the rest of the story from that point?
Right. She said, I'll teach you to ride a bike. So she went over and grabbed a branch off of a bush and started pulling the leaves off of it. And I knew what was coming. And we lived on a dirt road in Ellenwood, Georgia. And she got behind me and said, pedal that bike. And I remember, I'm crying. I'm 4 years old, 5 years old maybe, with snot coming out of my nose, tears going down my face. And she's behind me just hitting me with this switch. And she's right. I did learn to ride a bike to get away from that pain. And years later, I screwed up the courage to say, Mother, it's taken me a long time to appreciate bike riding. Do you remember that scene? I said, that really hurt. And she said, well, you learned how to ride a bike, didn't you? As if that settled it. And, I think of just kind of an unusual scene for a mother, but that shows she was mother and father both, and she had no experience in being either one, and she's working it out. And that just going after me with a switch, getting out that anger. I think the anger wasn't really about putting on the training wheels one more time. The anger was about, this is not right. I didn't deserve this, and I'm going to take it out on my boys who have messed up my life. And maybe also God who has messed up my life.
You say, quote, sometime during my elementary school years, the truth hits me that we are poor. That's why I've had to change schools so often. And you go on to say that you realized that you're seen as trailer trash. And as you noted earlier, you live on this trailer on church property. And that even that as well gets framed, that sort of poverty gets framed due to your mother's commitments, who says, I'm serving the Lord. That means we must make sacrifices.
Yeah.
But talk to us a little bit about how this coming to awareness of your poverty and how that worked in you as a young boy.
I guess the most obvious proof of that is every day when friends of mine would reach in their pocket and pull out the quarter that their parents gave them, and 25 cents would buy you school lunch in those days. And I had a paper sack that was reused until it had stains of grease all over it, and it was falling apart. And inside there were sandwiches like butter and mayonnaise sandwiches, or bologna sandwiches. That was the classic kind. And we'd be made fun of. In those days, they didn't have subsidies for school lunches. We couldn't even. The kids around us would make fun of the lunches. They'd call it train wreck and things like that instead of sloppy joes. And my brother and I were saying, man, we'd love to have sloppy joes today. That would be so great. That'd be better than what we get at home. And so I wore my brother's hand-me-down clothes, which never quite fit, you know, and a growth spurt, they would be up my leg instead of down and be made fun of. And we knew that kind of poverty. And I remember watching, in those days, there was a TV show called Queen for a Day. And these different contestants would stand up and give these sob stories about how terrible their life was. A woman with a disabled child, whatever. And again, I watch that show and say, our life is worse than that. We're worse off than they are. You know, Mother, you should apply for that show. And of course, she didn't appreciate that at all. But it's a different kind of poverty than would be experienced now in downtown cities. We lived out in the country. We had playmates. We had a dog. We had woods to explore. You know, we didn't go around with our heads down feeling we're losers. We just were aware we don't have money.
Your brother, you've already alluded to your brother Marshall, that he kind of plays a key role in your story. And part of that you narrate is that he grows increasingly, that the relationship between he and your mother grows increasingly hostile. Mm-hmm. And then that has this kind of impact upon you of increasingly distancing yourself or kind of drawing into yourself or isolating some. Would you kind of describe how that kind of unfolds?
Sure. It came to a head in my brother's life when he decided to go to Wheaton College. They had a conservatory of music, and Wheaton is a very respected school with kind of the evangelical label, at least it did at the time. Billy Graham attended there. But my mother, coming out of the group she represented, saw it as a liberal place. And when he first proposed going to Wheaton, she said, I'd rather you go to Harvard. They don't even believe in God. At Wheaton, they claim to, but not our God, not our kind of God. And then
and for those who are unaware, we should note that Wheaton, certainly at the time, was seen as quite conservative in the larger America.
Well, that's true. Right? Yeah, right.
But they're so liberal that she doesn't want them to.
That's right.
To go. Yeah.
So he finally got accepted at Wheaton, and then there came this hinge in his life that determined his future from then on, I suppose, where she put a curse on him. She said, if you go to this school, I will pray every day for the rest of your life that you'll be in a terrible accident and either die or, better yet, be paralyzed so that you have to lie there and look at the ceiling and realize what a terrible thing you've done, rebelling against God's will. And it was like poison gas in the room, Lee. I remember it so clearly. My brother just stalked out and slammed the door to his bedroom. But she did put a curse on him. Interestingly, he has a different memory of that scene. I talked about memory being unreliable. I'm quite sure that I remember it correctly. He remembers it differently. He remembers her saying, I will pray every day for the rest of your life that you'll lose your mind, because that's what happened. And I think he's kind of backfilled her prophecy. His very last semester, okay, he's a senior in college, one semester left at a respected school, Conservatory of Music, and he drops out and becomes one of Atlanta's original hippies. This is back in 1968, 69. And in a sense, fries his brain on LSD. Hippies gathered in Piedmont Park in those days and dropped acid. And that's what he did. And then eventually moved to California, went through every kind of addiction that you can think of, had no contact with our mother in over 50 years until I turned in the manuscript on the memoir, and then I got them on the phone for the first time. So I saw the choices he made. He broke that curse in a sense by saying, I'll do whatever I want. And he did whatever he wanted. But these were self-destructive choices. He should be on the concert stage playing the piano. Instead, he ended up tuning pianos, playing the same note, over and over and over. And that was a lesson to me. Don't go that route. Find another route. Find something that's a healthier way to grapple with some of the wounds of childhood.
Mm. He, at one point, asks you, or maybe it was that you suggest to him, let me back up and restart that question. At one point, you narrate how Marshall says to you that he feels as if he can never have a better life because of this curse that your mother has placed on him. And you say, as I recollect, something to him in terms of saying, well, if you really believe that's what's happening to you, let me ask her if she will remove the curse.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go and ask her?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I said to my brother, you're my brother. If you really believe that, there's only one person who can remove the curse, and that's our mother. So next time I go to Atlanta, then I'll ask her to do that. He just laughed and said, yeah, good luck. It was Christmas, and we went, and I waited till after Christmas Day itself. We were staying in a motel and just visiting daily and spending time with her, my wife and I. So finally, I got my mother alone. Janet went for a walk. And we sat down, and I said, Mother, Marshall has changed a lot. He's made a lot of progress. He's made some mistakes, but he knows he's made some mistakes, and he's actually doing better now than he ever has. And I told her about this conversation, and I said, Marshall, what could help you? And he said, nothing can help me as long as I'm under her curse. And I said, only you can remove that. And I had thought through different options. She might say, oh, well, we all say things in the heat of the moment that we later regret. But I was not prepared for her response. She got this rigid, I would say evil look in her eye. And she said, the way he went against God, I could never forget something like that. And as we talked, I realized, I said, well, you prayed this prayer. Do you really want him dead? Do you want your own son dead? Would you pray for that? And she basically said, you can't mess with a God like that. She didn't really answer my question, but it hung in the air as it has our entire lives. And not until her deathbed, really. She died in 2023 in May. She was 99 years old, had turned 99 the week before. And I finally did get the two of them together, as I mentioned on the telephone a few times before then. And then he called and just said, I want to tell you goodbye. And she died that night. Mm-hmm. It was as if, well, the hospice people had told me, she's hanging on to something. We don't know what it is, but sometimes if there's a family thing, if you can let her reconcile that in one way or another, then she will let go of life. And she did. My brother is a tragic character. People ask me, how did the memoir affect him? And the phrase he uses, one I appreciate, he said, it validated my existence. He admits, yeah, I made some bad choices. Probably wasn't the best trajectory of my life. But when you wrote it up, you validated it. So I think people can understand maybe why I became the person I was. And I think that's what I hope memoirs do. They do trigger responses in the reader where you apply your own situation, you put yourself in theirs, and it teaches you about your own. Mm.
You point to the ways in which, in working on the book, or even earlier in your life, you do begin to get glimpses of the ways in which you can make some sense of your mother's harshness or her lack of grace in her own childhood experience. Mm. Any episodes point out that would kind of help frame some of that?
Yes. I have been many times to the two-story, I guess, brownstone where my mother grew up. It only has 2 bedrooms. There's one kind of closet that they made into a sort of bedroom. But in that 2-bedroom house, they raised 6 children. Mm. And the men, three boys, 3 girls, and the boys were big, strapping football players. I have no idea how they did it. I mean, our trailer was luxurious compared to those circumstances. And my grandmother, my mother's mother, resented all these children. Birth control wasn't really on the map back then in the 1920s and 30s. And children would just appear. They went through the Depression, they went through the war, and life was tough. It was really hard. And at one point, my mother came in and apologized for something. She claims that she would get a whipping regularly just out of her mother's anger. And she would say, I didn't do anything. And her mother would say, well, I'm sure you did, but I don't know what it is. And maybe you don't know, but I'm sure you did. And just go ahead and whip her anyway. And at one point, she apologized for something she had done wrong. And her mother said, you can't possibly be sorry. If you were sorry, you wouldn't have done it in the first place. This catch-22, there's just no way to please this woman. So you're going to get beaten regardless whether you did something or didn't do something. And being in that environment, my own looked pretty soft in comparison. And you can understand why she became the person she did. She had no role model. She had no experience of love, until my father came along. And they truly did have kind of a fairy tale romance. They truly did have kind of a fairy tale romance. And then within a few years, he was taken away, as she saw it, killed, and left her with a miserable life of her own.
So when you go to college, you are originally still have, to use the phrase you used earlier in our interview today, you still have kind of your faith in abeyance.
Mm-hmm.
But you began to get a glimpse, even though you're quite frustrated with some of the constraints or the moralisms or the silly rules of the Bible college where you're in school.
Mm-hmm.
You began to get a glimpse of a bigger world, a larger world out there that you're interested in.
Yes, several things happened. I was not in a healthy place myself. I didn't like the idea of being at a Bible college. I'd look around me and snobbishly look at these kind of happy-faced Christians, and I took delight in sitting out in public or in chapel even, reading books like Why I'm Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell and books like that, The Secular City by Harvey Cox in those days. And, I'm just kind of a jerk, and I don't care about being a jerk. And as I mentioned earlier, I gradually grew softened, not so much to faith, but just to life in general by romantic love, by music, by nature. My solace was always taking walks in the woods and exploring animals and insects and plants and all of that. And then I had a dramatic conversion experience. And all these years, I've waited to give you details of that, because as soon as you say, this is what conversion is like, somebody say, well, I never had anything like that. And that's true. We don't. We have different experiences with God. Some people don't wrestle. I did wrestle, and I did need something that seemed to come from outside, something I didn't manipulate all by myself. And so God did visit me, and my life changed from that moment on. And it's not because I was seeking it, frankly. My brother was at that point, much more seeking of God and claimed he never found God. And I was trying to get away from God, and then was kind of interrupted by what I see as a visitation from God.
In talking about your college experience, you have a conversation with your brother Marshall, and you two are discussing trying to sort out what's fake and what's real. And when I got to that passage, it struck me that seemed like in many ways one of the threads that kind of runs perhaps through the whole of your book is that you're trying to sort out in what way, whatever this sort of religious tradition is, what about it's true, what about it's a lie? What's real, what's fake, what's inauthentic happiness, what's a deep, real joy. But commentary on that?
You're right. A thread not only in the book, but the thread of my entire life and my career. As I mentioned, pretty early on, I realized you can't trust what people say about their faith. You can't trust when people say it's God's will that your father will be healed, because he wasn't healed. He died. You can't trust that people of color were cursed by God, because you find out that that's wrong. An African-American was elected president of the United States. The church had lied to me. The church had misrepresented God. That was probably the worst thing they did. They misrepresented who God was. And so my whole life as a writer has been in sorting through, picking up the things I was taught, picking up the Bible, and sorting through what of this is authentic, what of this is worth preserving, and what should be discarded. When you grow up in a church environment, you learn behaviors that get you strokes. You stand up, give a testimony, you stand up and pray. People think that's so great when an 8-year-old stands up in church and prays. Isn't that cute? And after a while, you say, "Oh, that's how you get points. That's how you get strokes." And my mother was in charge of a lot of these camps in the summer. And some weeks I would decide, I'm going to be a good Christian, try to win the Camper of the Week award. And I would do it. And then the next week they'd want to kick me out, but my mother was in charge of the camp, so they could, where could they send me? And it was a learned behavior. It's like putting on a new jacket, putting on a uniform. And people think you're the person in the uniform. Actually, it's just the uniform they're looking at. And that caused me to spend the rest of my life. I didn't want to be like one of those hypocrites. I wanted to find out what is authentic. Like I write a book on prayer. A lot of prayers don't get answered. Some books on prayer tell you that all your prayers get answered. Well, they don't, not in the way you want. So how do you come to terms with that? And piece by piece, in my books, What's So Amazing About Grace, the Jesus I Never Knew, I review those things from childhood and decide which should be preserved and what should not.
One of the things that you point to in grappling with the inauthentic and authentic is that while you're in the midst of this very intense church environment, they're not pointing to things like Vietnam, race riots, cops beating hippies. The church isn't talking about that.
All right.
But this seems to be certainly one of the things that you're going to go on and try to say, if I'm going to have any sort of authentic faith, I've got to somehow make sense of the reality of the world. How did that come to be in you, that you felt as if I'm going to believe this stuff, then it has to intersect the realities of the world?
The Bible college I attended, like many of them, not all, was located outside of town, kind of on a compound with a lot of land around it. And we were like a bubble. So occasionally we would go to, say, a hospital or a prison and try to convert the people or preach the Sunday sermon or something like that. But we were really living in our own hermetically sealed world with its own rules, very strict rules. And we would only hear about things going on in the rest of the world. And then I would go home on Christmas vacation, and this is the 1960s, and you see girls in miniskirts, braless. You would see protesters holding up signs of babies being napalmed in Vietnam, and pictures of Richard Nixon, liar, liar. And it was culture shock. And I realized, we're sitting in this Bible college discussing issues that were being debated in the 4th century AD. And there are some major things going on in the world right now: justice and poverty and civilization and communism and war. And we're not studying anything that seems to relate to these issues. If faith is worth anything at all, it's got to have some sort of relevance to what's going on in the rest of the world. And my faith at that time did not.
When you think about the fact that your life takes one trajectory and Marshall's takes such a different, your brother Marshall's life takes such a different trajectory, what account do you give for that?
Some of it is birth order. He was first, and he responded to my mother's, I don't know what word to use, either strange child rearing, some would say mental imbalance. I'm not a judge there, but he responded to my mother's control by fighting it at every opportunity. And when you're 12, 13 years old, you're going to lose those battles. Adults win. They have more power, and they set the rules. And so there was a constant clash going on. And I realized that's not the way to get out, to survive. The way to survive for me was by being deceitful, frankly, by being a hypocrite, by acting one way and then doing what I wanted kind of off screen. And neither one is healthy. I have a passage in there about if I were going through the same circumstances today, I would probably be into self-harming, how these kids cut themselves or because pain is something I worked with a lot. I tell the story of breaking my own arm just to prove that I could do it without giving into the pain. And, I look back now and say, boy, that's weird. That's sick. It was a survival mechanism. And I have compassion for kids, especially right now. My goodness, you see the stats on depression and confusion and all that come out of social media. I sure am glad there wasn't a Facebook when I was going through some of that stuff 50 years ago.
Yeah. As you then began to take a different route and get glimpses of the power of words and find a path forward for your life, and have this sort of religious experience, how would you describe maybe the contours of the grace or the contours of the mercy, the contours of the beauty and goodness that you were drawn towards?
There's this statement that G.K. Chesterton used to use. I'm not sure he really came up with it, but he repeated it. He said, the worst moment for an atheist is when he has a deep sense of gratitude and has no one to thank. And that's what first got my attention about God, because I grew up with God, the image of God, as a stern taskmaster, as a bully, somebody who is going to crush my brother if he goes to Wheaton College, that kind of God. And through things like music, the beauties of nature, and romantic love especially, I was aware this world is a pretty nice place. It's got some great things in it. And if you believe God is creator, God must be somehow responsible for that. And this doesn't measure up to the image of God that I came away with. Just as you see a great work of art in a museum, you'd like to know something about the artist or the photographer who made this. I guess that's how I felt. I'd like to know that God. And then, we're told in the Bible that God gave us a face, that Jesus actually is the Son of God who came to show us what God is like and what we should be like. And I started in this college, Bible college, studying the life of Jesus, and he was a very different character than the Sunday school image I had, and someone I wanted to learn from and emulate.
So would you frame then the experience of writing your memoir as, in some ways, coming to know yourself anew, or what did this experience mean for you?
People who've read it will sometimes ask me, was that painful? Was that confusing? When I would know that I'm going to be writing a difficult passage this week, my wife would say, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And actually, it proved very therapeutic. What writers do is provide meaning and order to either ideas or stories or their own lives, in my case, through words. That's what we do. We sort it out and we try to come up with some sort of what was really going on and, in a sense, tame the wild animals of our lives that we haven't encountered yet. And it felt like that. It felt like discovery in part. I mentioned this period in high school when I was going through the search for pain, as it were. And I got a chance to, what was really going on there? I didn't go to a psychiatrist, probably should have, but we didn't have money for that kind of thing. But who was I trying to impress? Or what was I trying to teach? Why was I hurting myself? So I got the chance to stare at those things and to try to come up with some sort of coherent narrative that that resulted in who I am now. What a great opportunity. In fact, I'm a journalist. Everybody has a story. Probably everybody has a story worth at least a short book. And a writer gets a chance to do that, to just look at each piece, interview other people, try to come up with a coherent narrative of life, of how it unfolds, from which other people can learn.
Are there other things that you might wish for anyone listening that relates to these sorts of, especially some of the kind of difficult or painful experiences that you've shared? Are there things, in addition to perhaps trying to find some sort of way to frame their experience narratively through journaling or writing, other things you'd wish for them?
Well, I'll tell you what resulted in my work. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at the University of Virginia. And I've always hesitated to give a title in a talk when it's long in advance, because I don't know if I'm going to care about that when the time comes around. So they said, we have to have this brochure published, and it's 2 years from now. So just make up a generic title that would apply to anything. And I said, okay. How about 2 themes that haunt me? Oh, that's great. That's great. So they wrote that down. And then as time came around, 2 years later, they said, what themes are you going to be talking about? Oh, good point. Got to come up with some themes here. And I thought that through, and I was working on the memoir, and I said, seems obvious to me, suffering and grace. Suffering and grace. My first book was a book called Where is God When It Hurts? Then came Disappointment with God. The Question That Never Goes Away, all about pain. The Gift of Pain, I wrote. And then Grace. What's so amazing about Grace is the book I wrote that has sold the most. Discovering grace out of a legalistic, rigid background, that beautiful tone of amazing grace. And so those became the themes of my life and my writing. And frankly, I never had thought about that until I had to come up with the title for this talk. And my wife says, what you've done is write a prequel. And that's true. It's not an essay-like book like most of my other books. It's a narrative. It's a story. It's my story, a memoir. But it explains why I keep circling around and coming back to some of these same issues, mostly centered on suffering and grace. And those are, to me, 2 of the biggest questions we humans will face. Why, if there is a good God, why do so many bad things happen? And then grace. We live in a society in which we're all judged by our behavior, our income, our race, so many ways. What school we went to, what kind of car we drive. And as Jesus' stories show, he just turns everything upside down, and your worth is not determined by your income, by your race, by these other things. The Sermon on the Mount just turns it all upside down. Blessed are the poor, blessed are those who are suffering. Blessed are. It's an un-American message, but it's a message that people who are suffering really need and crave. Just the sense that God cares, that there will be a reversal, as Martin Luther King used to say, how long, O Lord, but the arm of the universe, the moral arc of the universe is bent toward justice. And that's a hard thing to believe in an unjust world, but that's what we're asked to believe and to give us hope to endure this world.
Been talking to Philip Yancey, author of more than 24 books, 17 million in print. And today we've been discussing his recent memoir, Where the Light Fell. Thank you, Philip.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Lee.
Hey there, quick favor. We're conducting an audience survey. We would be really grateful if you could take just a few minutes and answer our survey. Please visit survey.prx.org/no-small-endeavor. That's survey.prx.org/no-small-endeavor. Would love it if you'd go take that survey today. Thanks. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.